Hello everyone, Oli here, and this is the review of Timelash, the fifth story of the 22nd season of classic Doctor Who, starring Colin Baker as the Sixth Doctor. Timelash is the 142nd story overall, it's 2 parts long, and is written by Glenn McCoy. So the plot of this story is as follows. The TARDIS gets caught in the Timelash, a powerful time corridor that brings the Doctor and Perry into the troubled planet of Carthel. The planet is on the brink of war, ruled by an insane and much-feared dictator who punishes Carthelians by throwing them into the Timelash. But why is their leader never seen in person? And what links Carthel to 19th century Scotland? The Doctor arrives just in time to find out. So that is the plot of Timelash. So, Timelash, I really don't like the story whatsoever. I honestly think that Timelash is one of the worst stories, one of the very worst stories in Doctor Who's 60-year history. And I do find it ironic how my favourite Colin Baker story pretty much is preceded by my least favourite Colin Baker story. Yeah. The production was just a mess. The special effects were just terrible, even for the 1980s, and what made it even worse, this story was actually made on a low budget because Eric Saywood actually wanted the story to be produced in the following season, but McCoy was quite inexperienced, and Jonathan Turner insisted that the story had to be put into production, so it was all very helter-skelter, and Eric Saylor wasn't really able to do much to help McCoy because he was busy writing Revelation of the Daleks, and I think in McCoy's version of this script, I think the Daleks are included in some way, shape, or form, but then Eric Saylor pretty much had to tell him to rewrite it, so to speak. So I think even once the story was made, this is when the BBC decided to pull the plug on Doctor Who, and Revelation of the story, the Daleks at the time was meant to have been its last, but then thanks to fan protests, they were actually able to bring back Doctor Who, but it wouldn't be for at least another 18 months for Doctor Who to return. There was a scene in which the Doctor jumped into the Timelash and into this vortex crystal thingy where the crystals on the wall had obviously been scratched and people's remains were bored or shooting them to death. The skeletons looked like as if it was just ones that you see in the classroom, and the banjo this looked terrible as well. It looked like a very bad sock puppet, so to speak. It looked like it looked very brown. It's as if it hadn't been washed in years. It just looked it was a mess. Like the direction by Pennant Roberts was just terrible, and he's directed some brilliant stories in the past, but here was just no. And the script was okay. It was quite decent, but then it just didn't work. The plot itself wasn't bad, so to speak, but as I said before, it was made on a low budget, and that just pretty much fucked the execution, in my opinion. And part two was probably the worst paced of them all because the pacing was just all over the place. I'll get into it later, but on the surface, the storyline it didn't seem so bad because I had a young H.G. Wells, who is pretty much known as the father of science fiction. So without him, we probably would have had Doctor Who. But even though his identity isn't actually revealed until the very end of the story, so he's pretty much known as Herbert, and then we find out he's actually H.G. Wells at the end. And there was a nice callback to the Third Doctor's era when he and Jo, who visited Carthel in the past, and I assume this is probably when the Third Doctor was sent there on a mission for the Time Lords. So it was nice to see representation from that era again, and it was quite funny how the last story, The Two Doctors, was pretty much a representation of the Troughton era, and this story is sort of a mini representation of the Third Doctor era. In terms of memorable moments, I didn't think there were many, though most of it was quite forgettable because it was just a boring mess. I just even trying to come up with what to say for this review, it took me quite a struggle because it was just so bloody and memorable, and but there were some parts where it was actually quite memorable, like obviously the ending of the story, because as it was revealed that Herbert was actually young H.G. Wells, and that was the only scene worth remembering. And this is when how we found out was when Herbert actually wanted to stay on Carthel, but the doctor insisted that he needed to go back home, and then Perry was asking why, and then the doctor shows her his calling card, which has Herbert George Wells, I think that's his name. So yeah, that's how we find out that Herbert was H.G. Wells. So on to the acting. It was a good attempt. It wasn't really enough to save the story. Colin Baker did all right, but it was quite clear that he wasn't really impressed with the story. And the Doctor here seems a lot is good that he's a lot less difficult in comparison to other stories, which is good to see. And he and Perry seem to be enjoying each other's company, though they still bicker. But then it's not as bad as other stories. But I think there was one part where they actually do bicker, but the bickering was because of Perry actually wanting to stay with the Doctor when he wanted to prevent the Banjos from destroying Carthel with their missile. But then there was a scene, I think it was like towards the middle of part one, when the Doctor was like insisting that Perry doesn't actually like run off somewhere, and then she sarcastically replies, "Yes, sir," and just runs off after him. There was a nice scene at the start of part two when he had jumped into the time machine himself with some rope, and Tom, Colin Baker actually does try with the script, but then you can tell it really wasn't enough. Even when introduced into the story in the Colin Baker years, a classic on the in the Colin Baker years VHS release, he even says, when introducing the story, he says perhaps not a classic, which just pretty much shows that this story was just not meant to be. Nicola Bryant did good with what she was given as well, and she's actually said that Timelash was her least favourite story to film because she felt that Perry spent a lot of time being tied up, and which was a big step backwards for Perry, and which I honestly do agree with, because at the start she's separated from the Doctor, this is fairly early into the story after they arrive on Carthel, and then she ends up getting held hostage, which in order for the Doctor to cooperate in retrieving the amulet. Then Perry ends up in the Morlock's cave when she's antagonized by the Carthon rebels, Cats and Season, before they realize that she's not one of the bad guys. And then there's a scene in where she's literally like restrained somewhere, and she almost gets eaten by the Morlocks. So the Perry effect is quite bad here. There is a moment where the enemy, I think it was the Borad, he wanted Perry to be his mate, and obviously the Borad is just this ugly looking fella right here. This is him, and that's the bad guy. He wanted to recreate with Perry, which was just. So on to the very forgettable side cast, aside from a few. So first off, we have the one who obviously we can't forget is Herbert. He is a young school teacher enjoying a nice holiday in Scotland, and he was experimenting with magic just as soon as Vina appeared, who believes that he had summoned. And then the Doctor arrives, and the three of them go back to Carthel with the amulet, and Herbert aids the Doctor in stopping Borod and saving Perry. And at the end, it's revealed that at the end, as I said before, turns out that Herbert is actually a young H.G. Wells. Even though he was quite annoying at times, I did quite like his character. It was quite interesting. And so Vina, she stole the Borad's amulet from Tekka, and she threw it into the Timelash and then entered herself, which that's how she ended up in Scotland and where she met Herbert. Then we have Merkos. He was Vina's fiance and attempted to try and convince Venus to overthrow the Borad, which ended up in Venus's death, and he becomes the new Malin at the end of this. Not the end of the story, but I think after Venus died. So Tekka, he was the assistant of Venus and the Malin when Venus was killed, and he sent the Doctor to retrieve the amulet when he realized, and shortly after he realized what the Borad's true intentions were. He tried to, but it ended up costing him his life. Then we have Malin Venus. He was Venus' father, and he was convinced by Merkos to overthrow the Borad, which he disagreed to at first, but then allowed him to do so. But then, once the Borad hears what he was trying to do, that's when he's killed. And then we have the Carthel rebels. They consisted of Cats, Season, Garak, Gazak, and Aram. Cats' grandfather actually met the Third Doctor when he visited Carthel and was given a locket with a picture of Joe Grant inside. They also meet Perry, but they didn't trust at first, but then later aided the Doctor in stopping the Borad. And we have the Bandrel ambassador, a reptilian-looking alien from the planet Bandero. They represented their planet during the tension with Carthel, and at first, the relationship with the Carthelians was quite friendly, despite the tension of their food supply being halted. But because of their food supply being halted, they saw this as an act of war. So they fired the missile that would actually pretty much destroy all Carthelians, and this was the Borad's. The Borad didn't want to do anything. He wanted the missile to end up actually destroying the planet. So whilst everyone died, he wanted to create the planet and pretty much recreate Carthel himself. And that brings us to the enemy, the Borad. He was a dictator, and everything he had monitored and watched. And he pretty much banned mirrors because he didn't want to see the disfigured face as a result of a botched experiment that partially turned him into a Morlock's mutant, as you can see here. Which was and anyone that disobeyed him, he had them thrown into the Timelash, which was this unstable time corridor that brought the TARDIS into Carthel. Also, he had anyone that failed him age rapidly to death, and he was the one that caused the war between Carthel and Bandro by refusing to give them grain, and they were suffering from famine. His reasons for doing this was so the Bandros can actually fire a missile at their planet, and the missile will pretty much kill every single Carthel and every single one, everyone in Carthel, and the Bandros would eventually starve to death. So the Borad can now reproduce on this new planet and chose Perry as his mate. It's by having the same mutilation done to her. Dastardly motives, which seemed quite interesting, but the Borad was unfortunate at the receiving end of the most god awful writing that any villain Doctor has ever had, and I'll get into it fairly soon. It was terrible. So, on to the faults, and obviously, I think one of the main faults is that Timelash was just very dull, and this is an example of how the 45-minute two-part format for season 22 was just a complete failure. The pacing was just dog shit. Part 1 was really slow and it just made the story hard to follow, and part 2 just made it a lot worse of how the writing was just all over the place. And so here's a breakdown of what actually happened in part 2. So the part 1 cliffhanger saw the Doctor almost getting thrown into the Timelash. So how that's resolved, most of the Borad's men and other government officials that sided with him had all been disposed courtesy of the Timelash when they were all shoved in. The deadly android that was pretty much killing the other people as well had also been destroyed by the rebels, and Perry was saved from the Morlocks, and all this was done within the first 20 or so minutes in part 2. Tekka and the Borat ended up dying shortly afterwards, and then suddenly everyone just remembers that the Bandros have a missile coming into it's pretty much incoming. So the Doctor had to deal with that whilst arguing with Perry, who wanted to come with him, and then she pretty much agrees and decides to stay on Carthel, but then Herbert was actually hiding inside the TARDIS at the entire time. I was arguing with the Doctor to at least come with him for at least, this pretty much takes at least 10 minutes or so. The Doctor is able to stop the missile, but then the Board out of nowhere returns and pretty much holds Perry hostage, where it's revealed he actually cloned himself, and the Doctor actually saw die, but it was actually a clone. And we have a bit of more back and forth between the Doctor and the Board and everyone else for the next few minutes before backing into the Timelash after seeing his own reflection. And that was pretty much it, other than the ending when they all say their goodbyes. Herbert wants to stay on Carthel, but the Doctor tells him to come back with him and explains why he does, but he intends to do so that when he is revealed that he's actually H.G. Wells. So the plot of part 2 was rushed so badly, the plot made no sense whatsoever, and there was a lot of padding to compensate for the short plot, and the Borad was defeated way too early, and bringing him back by revealing he had a clone was just a very cheap plot twist that made no sense whatsoever, and the Perry effect was just quite bad because she gets kidnapped early on, almost gets eaten by a snake, and is chosen to meet with the villain. And honestly, do you agree that with Nicola Bryant in this story was just a huge how that Timelash was ever going to work, considering how rushed it was, and there really wasn't really any help available for the writer to do so. If it had been delayed for the original season 23, we would probably fixed the issues, and it would have been a decent enough story. I mean, I even think that it probably would have at least, probably if it was told in a 4-part format, I think it would have been somewhat better. And I honestly think that this train wreck really ruined the Colin Baker era even more. So I think Timelash probably gets a 2 out of 10. So my next review will be Revelation of the Daleks, the second installment of the Dalek Civil War storyline, and the last Doctor Who story to air for at least another 18 months. So thanks for watching. Please let me know what you thought of Timelash in this review. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. Until then, see you later.